In this movie, we're going to look at the differences between applying 2D textures as a projection or through UV space. So what we have here is we have a sphere that's been made editable by pressing C on the keyboard, and I have a material with a UV checkerboard in the color channel. So what we're going to do is we're going to drag this material and we're going to drop it right on top of our sphere. Now by default, you'll notice that the projection is set to UVW mapping, right? So what that's doing is it's reading the inherent UV space of the sphere. So what does that mean? Well, if we change this to the UV edit mode, you can see, I'll just turn off layers here so you can kind of see what's going on. You can kind of see that this sphere has been unwrapped essentially, right? So it's been cut here at the top and spread out. Actually, just to make this a little bit easier, I'm just going to make a new layer. And this is just like a Photoshop layer. But I'm just going to make a new layer and put it on the bottom here so you can see what's going on. There we go. Now you can clearly see what's going on here. So you see these triangles up here? They represent these triangles up here. So it's basically like somebody took a globe and kind of cut it and turned it into like a flat map. So you have a map of the Earth or a map of a globe, and then it's wrapped around the object. So it's cut up top here. So that is how it initially is applied. Let's turn this stuff back on. So that's how it's reading this initially. There are also ways that we can do it without needing to rely on the UVs, because for some objects, it's just easier to use projections. Now what a projection does is it's basically saying, okay, imagine you are taking this 2D flat texture, right? So in this case, we're taking this 2D flat picture here of a checkerboard. And how do we want to apply it to a shape? Think about like an overhead projector that you used to have in your classroom as a kid, right? You'd have the 2D texture or the slide, right? That you would go and put inside of the 3D projector. Now, what could you do with that 2D object? Let's say it was a slide. You could rotate it. You could basically flip it upside down. There's not a whole lot you can do with it. However, the 3D projector in the room, you could rotate it. You could angle it off different walls. You can move it closer. You can move it around. That is how we're projecting things. So think about it like this. If I select this tag and change the projection to flat, right? Now I'm going to click on sphere. I'm going to click on this little texture mode over here. Okay. This is kind of like taking that 3D projector in a classroom and projecting it flat along the z-axis. Well, if you look at it straight from, let's say, where you would be sitting in the room, everything looks great, right? Because you're looking straight down the axis that the projector is projecting onto a sphere. However, when you start to look around the side, you can see, oh, I see. This is where it's starting to break. The texture is starting to smear because you're taking a flat projection and you're stretching it around the side of the sphere. Well, that's not going to work. That's going to start breaking, right? You can kind of see how it does that on the side. It only works from the flat angle that you're projecting from. What else do we have? We have cubic, which basically says, okay, one from each side. So it's basically a whole bunch of flat projections. You could tell this would be useful for, that's right, a cube. We have a whole bunch. Cylindrical, bet you can guess what that does, right? Now let's just hypothetically say that this was like really, really big when you first applied it, right? So let's say it was like 500, 500, 500. You're probably wondering, well, why is he doing that? It wasn't that big. That's right. But sometimes it is when you initially apply your projection. And that's like way too big. All you need to do is go to tags and fit to object, and it'll kind of snap down and fit. Now from there, you can actually go into your rotate tool and rotate the texture around. So it's projecting from different angles. So obviously this would be very useful for a cylinder. Let's say you're making like a column or something. This would be very useful projection. Some of the most common ones I'll show you. Here's a spherical projection, right? In this case, the sphere looks a lot like the UVs. We also have a frontal projection. What the frontal projection does is it's basically looking through the camera that we're using right now in the viewport. So you see that? So this is kind of cool. Like if you wanted to park on an angle, Let's say you're looking through a camera, matching it to a photograph or something. You can kind of line this up and say, okay, that's right there is where I want that texture to live. And once you're happy with that, all you need to do, let's actually delete this UV tag, is say generate UV coordinates. And now it changes it from a frontal projection into a UV projection. So now no matter where we rotate, those coordinates are based on the camera, or the viewing angle, I should say, that we were using a couple moments ago. And at any point we can, change this back. Another one that I love to use all the time is camera mapping. And what this does is it basically says, okay, if there's a camera in the scene, we can drag the camera into the camera field, hit calculate, and now this projection is basically using the location and the viewing angle of this camera to create its texture. So if I take my camera here and I move it around, you'll see that now that really looks like what we were talking about before with the 3D projector, in a room, right? You can picture this is the projector projecting it onto a wall, or in this case, onto a sphere. So this is another really cool way of using textures. I like to use this a lot for a lot of the stuff that I do. So let's go back and delete that. We'll change this back to, let's go to spherical. Now inside of the tag, you have the ability to offset it, which is going to spin it. Well, I say spin because it's a sphere, but it's basically just offsetting it in U, which is horizontal, and offsetting it in V, which is vertical, right? It's just going on here. Now what's cool is that once it starts to get too small, you can actually just tile it and it will repeat. The more you tile something, let's just tile it 4 times in each direction, it's going to get a lot smaller. Problem with that is you'll start to see it repeat. Certain instances, you can actually apply the seamless option, which if it's something like, rock or concrete or dirt, that may work because it's basically just going to repeat the edges. And that may work. It may blend together nicely. Obviously with this, it's going to create some funky hot spots, almost looks like a weather radar map or something. So that's not going to work in this case, but just wanted to point that out to you, that you do have the ability to offset it using projections, the length, essentially the size in both directions, how many times it'll be tiled. Let's go back and set this to, actually, if you just right click on it, you can hit reset to default and that will work. I use right click, reset to default all the time when I'm working inside of CINEWARE 4D. So that is how we use projections. In a later video, we're going to get into more UV editing. You could spend a whole course on UVs. We'll get into just some of the basics, but I did want to point out here how we can simply use projections instead of relying on the need to create a UV map for all of our objects. So we'll definitely take a look at UV editing in an upcoming movie.